Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Eddie Paul, Associate Director of Special Collections at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, and it's my pleasure to also welcome and introduce to you Hannah Pollin-Galay, the author of Occupied Words: What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish, a book that was published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press, a remarkable work that explores how the Yiddish language was changed by the Holocaust. Although, as we'll find out, a shift in language also means a shift in the way we describe and create a narrative, which in this case represented a seizure in history. Um, just a very personal remark. I took 3 to 4 months to read through this book because I could only read it in very small bursts. That's just how intense and how concentrated and how distilled this book is. I have in my career as a collections librarian, which kind of petered out last year, I see a lot of academic works published, and this one really stands out as a book that is not only written with rigorous scholarship, but also with great sensitivity. Now, some housekeeping before giving you a brief background on Hannah's life and accomplishments. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, which can be directed in one of two ways. Through the Q&A, which is our preferred way of communicating with us at the bottom of your screens. If you would prefer to direct your question to Hannah directly, please just raise your hand using the Zoom feature and I'll make you audible and or visible. We do prefer the Q&A though, it's just a little bit more efficient. Hannah is Associate Professor in the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, where she is also head of the Yonah Goldrich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. Her research and teaching is primarily in the fields of Yiddish literature and Holocaust studies. Her first book, Ecologies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, which was published by Yale University Press in 2018, explores how people remember differently in different languages and geographic contexts. She's been awarded a number of prizes for this research, including a Fulbright Fellowship, a Yad Vashem Research Award, and a Shoah Foundation Research Grant, as well as a Rothschild Postdoctoral Fellow in the Humanities at the Columbia University Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. In addition to being a 2024-25 Senior Scholar at the Fortunoff Archive for Holocaust Testimony at Yale University, Hannah is also a Yiddish Book Center Translation Fellow, where, amongst other things, she's been translating Yiddish poetry from the Holocaust, including the poetry of Chava Rosenfarb, whose Montreal connection should be well known to many of you. And we'll be talking about Chava in the course of the next hour or so. Hannah, by way of asking you to give a synopsis of the book for those unfamiliar with it, I read an interview where you described the circumstances that led up to the book and some of the field research you did. And I wonder if you could tell everyone a little bit about why you felt this book needed to be written and how you came to write it.
Thank you, Eddie. It's really a pleasure to be here and welcome everyone. I really like to work on mysteries. I like to start with something that perplexes me or bothers me or keeps me up at night and go from there. So this is how this book started. It was actually there were a confluence of two different factors. One, I was working on Holocaust testimony, as you mentioned, in different languages for my first project. And I was listening to hours and hours of video testimony from the 1990s in Yiddish, Holocaust video testimony. And I kept hearing these strange words in Yiddish. And, I'm not a native speaker. I know Yiddish very well, but there are words here and there that I don't know. And I would look in dictionaries and I would ask, my mentor, like David Roskis, who is a native speaker, I'm not really sure what that word is. And I noticed that these words didn't just crop up in these oral testimonies, these interesting and mysterious words, but that the witnesses, the Holocaust survivors, use these words in a special way with a kind of wink and a nod, like, pay attention to this word. And I was beginning to think about these words and what they did for memory. And they're kind of like memes are today, a way that a specific community marks one word or phrase or place as a hotspot of memory. And around the same time, a colleague of mine from the Hebrew University, Amos Goldberg, handed me this book, Nachman Blumenthal, Wörter und Wörterlich von der Khurbn Words and Phrases from the Holocaust Era, and said, this is interesting, but I don't really have much to do with it because I'm not a Yiddishist. And and I opened it up, and there it's a dictionary of over 3,000 words of neologisms from the Holocaust, like the ones that I'd been hearing by chance in these oral testimonies. And I said, oh my gosh, and first of all, the words that I'd heard were there. So I knew that it was legit, this was real material. And there were so many of these words. And then I started looking around and I found that there were so many of these dictionaries. And so so I knew that this was something, there was a huge network of meaning, a whole meaning world that had been created in Yiddish during the Holocaust in this new sociolect, and I knew that this was incredibly meaningful to people since they had written so much about it. And so I set to work on this, and I was fascinated, and I read these dictionaries like they were, thrillers. Couldn't put them down because every single word brought you into a world, into the day in the life of, and really close to experience. And that's how I, knew I wanted to write the book. It's really coming to it that way through this discovery.
And you spent some time, I know I think I had read that you spent some time doing field research. You were just sort of encamped somewhere it was in the Negev Desert reading
Yeah.
Chava Rosenfarb's memoirs. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, all right. So we're okay. So then there's right. So that's one layer of the read of my process was to read these dictionaries and to feel, these scenes, hunger and theft and getting up and sleeping in camps and ghettos. And then another layer is to look at some of the references that Blumenthal and others made. Like, how did they discover these words? Where did they know about them from? What's the network beyond, each word? A dictionary is a communal conversation. It's a way of crisscrossing different ideas and different people's memories. And I started to notice that Rosenfarb was coming up again and again and again. Katsetnik was too, that these two authors were major sources for this research. They added their own artistic framing and flavor and color to the way that they used Khurbn Yiddish, Holocaust Yiddish, but they also they use real words. Katsetnik less reliably than Rosenfarb, but so once I saw this, I said, okay, I have to read, I have to read this start to finish. I'm talking about Rosenfarb's trilogy. I'm sure that for the Canadians here needs no introduction, but Chava Rosenfarb, one I say of her most seminal accomplishments was to write a 2,000-page three-part trilogy of the Lodz Ghetto, called The Tree of Life, Der Baum von Leben. And I think that probably her daughter, Goldie Morgenthaler, might even join us, and translator and scholar of her. In any case, I mean, how does somebody with, children and a career and all this read a book of this volume? Well, for one thing, I read in an essay that Rosenfarb wrote about her writing process that she would get up very early in the morning and write for like an hour or two before her children woke up, like at 4 a.m, something like that. So I tried that for a while. Like I tried to imitate her writing process and my reading process. And I got up really early and read, and I marked each Khurbn Yiddish neologism that she used on the page, and I had a color coding system. And then I wanted to, still it's 2,000 pages. I wanted to finish it. So yeah, I went to a place called Azuz, which is it's on the Egyptian border with Israel, and there used to be no internet. Maybe there's internet now, but there's no internet and no phone reception, which is the perfect way if you want to read a great work of literature with no interruption. So I brought the 3, volumes there, and I read them start to finish, marking each of the words. And it was quite an experience, I have to say. In one instance, I actually said that I would go I would go to this place, to this hut in Azuz to talk to Rosenfarb. And somebody thought that I was serious. They're like, is she alive? I said, no, no, but you don't understand. If you read her this intensely, you're going to feel like you're talking to her. And I had this conversation with her about language and about the words that she was using. And one thing that I noticed, and we haven't really talked much about the words themselves yet. I hope we will, but it was that she starts off by teaching you all these words, so they pile up more and more and more intensely throughout especially the middle book of this trilogy, where you're in the ghetto and you're learning words like kava pletzelach and uh, and uh, and jalke and all these words that just keep accumulating constantly. And of course, hundreds of not hundreds, I don't know, but tens of different words for Chaim Rumkovsky, the head of the ghetto, der Prezis, Nisia Yehudim. All these words start to accumulate, and she's essentially giving you a language lesson in this secret language of the ghetto until it's not a secret anymore. You're a speaker of this new language by the time you get through book two. And once you're into book three, she expects you to follow without much help. So it's an incredible process. Just the experience of reading helped me to understand what language metamorphosis felt like for people who underwent it, since she kind of guides you through that language process as a reader.
I wanted to get back to Chava later, but what you're suggesting is that Chava kind of gave people the code. You know,
She did. Yeah, and she wanted to give people the code. I mean, that's my reading of it. I feel like I talked to her. I didn't, but she said that, she wrote that in her first collection of poetry, Ghetto und andere Lieder. It was published also as Die Ballade von Nächtigen Wald und andere Lieder, the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest and other poems. And actually, I've been working on the translation of the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest. But in any case, in the introduction to that, and I love that introduction. It's one of the most beautiful and moving pieces of writing by a survivor that I've ever read, especially because she's so young. She comes out of, Bergen-Belsen, and she has I mean, some other people in this webinar have also been young women before. I have. That was a while ago. There's every reason in the world to doubt yourself, and especially as a Yiddish speaking Holocaust survivor who's just been told that she's subhuman, and treated that way, and that Yiddish doesn't matter. And she comes out and she addresses the work to people of the world and to Jews who weren't there. And she doesn't come to them and translate her experiences into a language that everyone around the world will be able to digest easily. She says, there's going to be words here, ghetto wörter, that require some learning, some explanation. But we're going to do that, and eventually they're going to become unser allemans Eigentum. All the estate for us all of our shared culture, our shared platform, which is an incredibly powerful framing for what Khurbn Yiddish is, what Holocaust Yiddish is, and what it can do, what it is as a generative project, in that it is about documentation. It is about learning what people did in a kind of neutral chronicling sense. But it's more than that. It is for her. It's that you can bring people in to your experiences as a survivor, as a victim. You can bring them into your language. And by virtue of them taking that spiritual vocabulary lesson from you, they're going to create a new post-war community. And that post-war community is going to be based on the Eigentum, the estate of Yiddish survival. So I really realize, that I love that. I put that in, it's in the introduction to the book, it's in the conclusion, and it really helped me. It inspired me. I love it. I just want to share it as much as I can, but it also helped me to explain what I think this is so important today. Documentation is always important. We can't stop learning about the Holocaust, even if it's not fancy or, creative or exciting. We have to study documentation and history. But there's something else that I wanted to do with this, which is to say that dictionaries or looking at language, learning these words is an ethical act of memorialization that is different than any other kind of memory act.
Yeah, I was actually curious whether you were familiar with any kind of analog to these kinds of dictionaries prior to the Holocaust, or whether this was a unique, that this was kind of a unique phenomenon or not.
In the mid 20th century, I mean, let's say that late 19th century through the mid 20th century at least was an era of philological enthusiasm, language zeitgeist. People were into language, and it's hard for us as people in 2025 to realize in some ways because I think we have more distance to language, but people are incredibly invested in language at that point in history. They really experienced language changes. They were very attuned to it, and there's a book about language change in World War One, Raymond Williams, and in World War One, British soldiers were so, and not literary scholar soldiers, low education British soldiers were writing about how new words were cropping up in the English language. And so there was a language change that happened in World War One, but there was also language consciousness during World War One that you can really see. Hitler and Stalin were both incredibly invested in words and in language. There was a dictionary of the Bolshevik Revolution that was both prescriptive and descriptive, meaning it listed new words that were invented, but it also explained to people how to use them so that they could be good Soviet revolutionary citizens. Hitler had, I mean, the Nazi regime had words of the day that they published daily. They even had fonts that they preferred. And, and it's not just extremist authoritarian regimes that were invested in language. There wasn't an ideology at the time that wasn't invested in language. Franz Boas, he argued the opposite of the Nazis, that all human cultures are equal based on language study. So there are precedents for dictionary writing as a political platform, as a personal platform, all over the place at the time. These people who are writing about language in Yiddish language in the camps and in the ghettos and afterwards are drawing on the spirit of the time. They're drawing on the philological zeitgeist around them. However, they are doing something unique. They're doing something unprecedented. The torment, the violence of Nazi camps and ghettos are unprecedented. And what they did to Yiddish was, I don't want to say fully unprecedented. Maybe in some colonial violent situations, there was a similar attack on a given language. But the proportion of Yiddish speakers that were hurt, displaced, or killed by the Holocaust is enormous. I think most people know the statistic, but out of 11 million Yiddish speakers worldwide, 5 million were murdered in the Holocaust. And that's just the people who died. That's not the people who were displaced. And that doesn't include, of course, the future Yiddish speakers that were eliminated through the Holocaust, because the Holocaust destroyed those East European Jewish communities, which would have produced more and more Yiddish speakers and more Yiddish creative acts. So given that, and that Yiddish speakers were put in these very, very enclosed spaces of imprisonment with bizarre and draconian and all-encompassing rules, with 40 different languages around them, like in Auschwitz, there are 40 different languages. So the multilingualism, the level of the suffering, the cramped conditions, all of those are unprecedented in a way, unprecedented for what's happening to a language. And combine that with a community that's very invested and interested in language. And I think you have something that draws from its surroundings, but is unique to that moment. And that's where you get this both incredible fascination, fear, and disgust of what is happening to my words. People are writing about this. And also this creative will to use these words to resist on some cognitive or cultural level.
Yeah, you presaged my next question, which was about the title of the book, which has both political and grammatical implications. The political one is obvious, but perhaps less obvious is the accusative form the word Yiddish assumes as the object of the action. I'm wondering if what Yiddish did with the Holocaust is as much the subject of the book as what the Holocaust did to Yiddish. I think you
Yeah,
answered a little bit of that, but
that's a really wonderful question. And I'll say first of all that a lot of people, including my publisher, the University of Pennsylvania, really didn't like the title. They didn't want me to use it. Occupied words. It sounds like, occupied Ukraine, occupied Palestine, occupied Wall Street. Um, but I can't really change a title once I've chosen it. The title chooses me first of all, and also it really does say what I wanted to say about language, which is that we all know that an army or some violent force can occupy land, but we don't think about how that same military regime can occupy a language, meaning take it over and you're still there. The speakers are still there, but there's some kind of voice that's come inside them and is speaking through them. And I talk about a lot about that in the chapter where I discuss the connection between, oh, pardon me, between German and Yiddish, and the way that there's German is penetrating inside the Yiddish language, and people can feel themselves quoting the Nazis as they're trying to speak in their own voice. So
yeah.
that's occupied. My voice is occupied by a Nazi German voice, and I'm trying to be myself, but I'm also speaking through the voice of the person who's oppressing me, because that's the only language
Yeah.
that's available. That's the passive side. But there's also occupied in another sense, which is that these words occupied people's minds and they gave them something to think about, and gave them a way to process what was going on. They were preoccupied, you could say, that when diarists or librettists, when a librettist in the, a cabaret librettist in the Warsaw Ghetto writes a cabaret song using, Khurbn Yiddish neologisms to spoof them, he's preoccupied by these words in a way that's creative and engaging his intellectual faculties and giving him a way to, in a sense, reassert himself. So there's different senses of occupation, and in that sense, yeah, the Yiddish speakers are doing something back with the language, and it's not simply just a passive construction.
I want to get back to the ways in which German infiltrated Yiddish later, because we actually spoke about this. One of the attendees this evening, Aaron Kristalka, spoke about that at the evening we had a few nights ago on the Unser Stimme, and I do want to get back to that because that was a particular interest to me. But I wanted to talk about some of the lexicographers that you deal with in the book. The teacher and activist Nachman Blumenthal, who was one of the subjects of your book, experienced something similar to what you experienced as you were researching Yiddish language Holocaust testimonies, that there were Yiddish words he discovered when he returned to liberated Poland after living in Soviet Russia that he couldn't understand. I wonder if you could describe how some of these words, and I know you have your favorites, Shabrev, and I know that a lot of these words just recur, which were coded words for coded experiences, and how they formed microcosms for what Jews experienced in the ghettos and the camps. So maybe you could give a few examples that particularly spoke to you.
Yes, sure. So the words are a great way to get inside this. And yes, Blumenthal returned from the unoccupied Soviet Union to Eastern Poland, and he didn't understand what people were saying. And he said they were using words like kripo, which means Kriminalpolizei, criminal police, Obman, Aktia. Everyone knows Aktia now, Aktion, but he didn't know it at the time. And he said there was a language gap and I couldn't understand them. And then he set out to record the words. I think that some of the words that I've looked at as hotspots, you mentioned Shabrevin, which is a really interesting one, which a lot of Yiddish speakers, unless they're connected to Holocaust vocabulary in some way, haven't heard of. It sounds kind of like nonsense. It sounds a little bit like gibberish, but it meant, and this is the funny thing, that Blumenthal defined it as looting and also taking ownerless property, which is of course paradoxical. Something can't be looted if it's ownerless. It's not stealing if it's ownerless. If it's ownerless, it's not stealing. So why do you have to have these two meanings housed in one word? And everyone stumbles on this contradiction when they're trying to define Shabruvin. And debates within the Warsaw Ghetto, which is where the word came from, circled around the same idea. Like, what is this word, and why do we have to use it so much? Peretz Opochinski, who was a journalist in the Warsaw Ghetto, after the Great Deportation in 1942, his whole world has collapsed. His life as he knew it around him is gone. Almost 300,000 Jews have been deported. And he sits down and writes a 6-page essay on Shabrevin. And he says this word needs to go down in history as simin muvhak, the paradigmatic sign of our time. And why was it? Well, first of all, poverty leads to constant stealing, and there are hundreds of different words for stealing in the ghetto, and that's a fact, right? I keep going back to this, that we can't get too over sophisticated before we recognize that these words show us facts. It shows us poverty, but the word was important to him, and it was important to others because it showed meaning on the move. That everyone was constant. People were speaking Khurbn Yiddish. We're chasing after the meaning of words from day to day. Does shabrevin mean theft? Does it mean looting? Does it just mean taking things from houses of people who have been expelled? Does it mean just generally, wheeling and dealing? And that is a part of their experience that they wanted to show. And Shabrevin captured that in an incredibly powerful way. Another word that it's hard to talk about, but I think is really, really important, and one that a lot of the people who wrote about Khurbn Yiddish, commentators, lexicographers, were very invested in, was the word people. Pei Yud, Pei Ein Lamed, which meant more or less a young male sex slave in Auschwitz, maybe other places too. But this word, it's a German Yiddish hybrid, in that it seemingly comes from a rare German regionalism for the male sexual body part, but it also was interpreted by Yiddish speakers as a Yiddishization of the German word for doll, Puppe. So they thought it was like, how Yiddish has good git. They thought that they were turning Puppe people and Yiddishizing it. And that's how that's how Yiddish speakers, that's how Blumenthal understood the word, in fact. And it was a German Yiddish hybrid, and the word was a gender hybrid. It was considered a combination of male and female in this poor young boy and his role. And I think that word really struck people as horrifying, both because of the fact that it documents, but also in that it showed a kind of effeminization of the Jewish male body in the Holocaust. That is, if you look at Lamentations or Ezekiel or all kinds of Jewish liturgical text, you see the woman's body as a symbol of the downfall of the Jewish people, right? Oh, but Bat Yerushalayim in the daughter of Jerusalem in Lamentations, there's a defiled woman, and that's the Jewish people under hardship. And here you have a defiled boy in the Holocaust. So it's like history is broken, and the Jewish male body has become effeminate in this circumstance. Now, of course, there's lots of disturbing, gender assumptions that are embedded in the way that they talk about this word, but they're very important to understand the cultural memory that people were bringing into the experience in the Holocaust and in the camps. And as one last example of a word that I think is great to bring up, and it brings us back to Chava Rosenfarb, and it has to do with my name, is Chanale. So believe it or not, my very name, was a Khurbn Yiddish word in the Lodz ghetto, and it meant wood chips that were stolen, wood scraps that were stolen from tram cars for wood at home to keep yourself warm, to cook, and so forth. And this word is defined in the Encyclopedia of the Lodz Ghetto. That was a lexicographic project that happened in real time in Lodz. They had an encyclopedia that they were creating, and the encyclopedia included, lots of information as well as word definitions. And they have a definition for Hanale, and they explain it that originally they had all kinds of words for, the words for theft always have to keep changing because they're trying to mask what they're doing from the overseers, from the Nazis. And so that originally it was called Halenemen, taking challah, ripping off a piece of challah dough, during for ritual purposes during baking, and then somebody somehow switched one consonant from challah to chane, and the word for this wood theft became chane. So my name was a word for wood theft. Rosenfarb brings this definition, this word, into the Tree of Life in the most beautiful passage. And she gives a different etymology. I don't know who's correct. I like hers. It might be an imaginative projection, might not be, but she says it's that when these people who were working on the tram cars, the Jews, were about to take these wood scraps, they looked at the wood scraps and they remembered the furniture that these wood scraps used to be a part of, drawers, shelves, and they remembered the Jewish texts, the prayer books, the family albums, the personal letters that used to be in those drawers. And they remembered that there were women named Hanale and Rivkele who took care of those drawers. So these women are like Kohaniyot, they're caretakers of a holy ark, and that they are their memory, the memory of these women, these housewives that everybody always forgets, not just in Holocaust history. Those women's memory were contained in the wood scraps, and when the wood scraps are gone, their memory is contained in the neologism Hanale. So even if it's not factually accurate, that gets it the exact power, the incredible potency of these words, that when everything else about this civilization is gone, when even the people who remembered the civilization is gone, when the material scraps are gone, there's something that does remain, and that's the word. And the word is itself a kind of holy ark, because inside it, you can open it up and see all of the experiences and the texts and the civilization. So, I mean, I've always liked my name, but I came out of that, passage, recommitted to the name I was given at birth.
Right. You had anticipated that question because I was actually going to ask you specifically about Hanukkah I mean, I had when I was reading that passage in the book, I thought it was a kind of sublimated attempt to de-objectify de-objectify an object by assigning it a name. So it was a sort of an attempt to inculcate some humanity within, the catastrophe that was happening all around them. But
Yeah, that's beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, and I think that is definitely, I think, Rosenfarb's part of Rosenfarb's project in bringing these words up, is to say, let's take these scraps, the verbal scraps, the wooden scraps, the human scraps from the edges, and let's humanize them. Let's give them a long story. That's why the book has to be so long. It has to be monumental. Let's give these nobodies a story. There's somebody. Let's give the wood scraps a history. These aren't just wooden scraps. They were part of furniture. The furniture was a part of a home. There was a civilization here. So you're right. Everything becomes animated with humanity and memory in the way that she uses these words. And I think that goes for a lot of the Khurbn Yiddish commentators in general. I mean, people who are in in camps, in ghettos, when they stop and reflect on a word, it's a humanizing moment. When Avram Levite, a teenager in Auschwitz, writes he writes it's very difficult to write in Auschwitz, meaning like hard to get pen and paper. And when he manages to do it, he says, this is hard and I don't have the right words, but deaf and the people who are mute, heart of speech, they find a way to speak. So I'm going to also. So he kind of announces that his speech, his writing is going to be problematic, and that he doesn't have any language other than language that's infused with Nazi terminology. Occupied words are the only words he has, but he uses them in a creative way to deoccupy them. So he writes in one instance, he says, a shipment of prisoners arrived, a humanitarian act, which of course it's not. And then he writes, Ausgesiedelte Menschen. Aussiedlung was also a hotspot word, which in Nazi vocabulary, in regular German, Aussiedlung means just relocation. In regular Yiddish, Aussiedlung means to curse someone or to scold someone, but it took in the German meaning as relocation, but not actually relocation, being sent to a camp to die. So there's all these layers. It's an incredibly confusing word, Aussiedlung. So it's a hotspot word. But when he, as an Auschwitz prisoner, stops and takes that word into his ironic reflection on language, he's rehumanizing himself through the word. And he's stopping and like you said, he's de-objectifying the word and himself and the people there by pausing and like putting, an analytic fence around the term.
Yeah.
So I think it's true in Rosenfarb's very, um, very, intentional way of using these words, very reflective. But it's also true in a lot of the less intentional, less polished writings on Khurbn Yiddish.
Before I ask my next question, because you've just spurred on three three others.
All right, I didn't mean to
Um,
steal all your questions. Okay.
yeah. Uh, Last year, I was giving a talk to a McGill class about the origins of the word Khurban and Shoah and how that emerged and how that kind of evolved through the Holocaust years. You had talked, you'd written a little bit in the book about post-Holocaust and how you had mentioned people, the word people, and how when Elie Wiesel wrote Wenn die Welt hat geschwiegen, which was the Yiddish original, the title for Night, there was a horrific scene in Night that was sanitized in the French translation. So in post-Holocaust narrative, in post-Holocaust memoir, and Night is one of those books that is kind of ambiguously described, at least in library terms, both as a novel and as a documentary. It's kind of difficult to place it, and we've had issues cataloging it, for years now. Um, that was one example of the ways in which particular, events that were documented had become sanitized once the literature was starting to transform into narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. People, that's we're going back to the word people, P-I-P-E-L, this word for a young male sex slave in Auschwitz. And that it just pops up everywhere. People talk about it, in all kinds of ways. It's a preoccupation. And it comes up in the Yiddish version of Night and the World Kept Silent in one of the most famous scenes, in the hanging scene. Anyone who's taught Night, read Night, studied it in middle school, everyone stops and spends time on the hanging scene, which is, the moment where in the international version, let's call it, because we have to remember that the French version is not just the version that French speakers read, it's the international version. It's the one that was on Oprah and so forth. It's the one that's taught in schools all over the world, or at least in the English speaking world. And the hanging scene in the international version is a test of the main character, or the narrator author's test of faith. He sees a young blonde boy hanging from the gallows, and he says, that's God is hanging from the gallows. I lost. That's when God died. And that's the relevance. That's the valence of the scene in the international version. And in the Yiddish version, and in the English version, by the way, there's this little word in italics that the boy was a people, but he doesn't gloss the word, he doesn't explain what the word is. So whenever I teach this novel memoir, which I have many times, I ask the students, so did you read the scene? Yes, we read the scene. Did you understand everything that happened in the scene? Yes, we understood everything that happened in the scene. Okay, what's a people? It's just a word that's in italics in English and it just slips under the radar unless you're, looking things up. Um, and then in Yiddish, so the word is it's present but not explained. It's like a dog whistle in English. It's there for those who will understand it. Though it's there to press a button and awaken the memory of Khurbn Yiddish for those who know what Khurbn Yiddish is. In Yiddish, not so. It's this expanded explanation. It's kind of a disgusting explanation. I mean, Wiesel, says that he accuses all of the capos of being homosexuals. It's and homosexualism as an accusation, like he's conflating homosexuality, queer sexuality and pedophilia. It's a frightening moment for us to learn a little bit about Wiesel as a person of his time. That's all. That's who he was. He wasn't a prophet. And in that sense, it casts a different light on the whole project of the book, that this isn't a survivor prophet bringing us, God's truth from Sinai. It's a human, a man of his time who had his prejudices. But it's more than that. It's getting at the gritty embodied experience of Holocaust survival, which often was sexual and it was embarrassing and unseemly. That was true, and that was the way that people talked and felt about themselves and their experience at the time. So there is greater truth in that, unfolding the accordion and letting those ugly notes out through the explanation of people in the Yiddish version. It's interesting. I ask my students, a lot of times I say, okay, so which version of the book is better? It's not a good question, but for undergrads, it's a provocation to say, well, is it better to have this, cleaned up version where people aren't going to be disgusted by Jews? I mean, that's also, he's doing it as self-protection. This is 1950s, it comes out. There's so much anti-Semitism. You don't need to hear about, Jews as sex slaves in Auschwitz. He wants to promote the Jews as humans. It's understandable. Or is there something good about getting at this truthful language and getting into the experience more? And there's never a right answer, but I'm trying to say that it's a different truth that comes out through this Yiddish version and through the big explanation of what a people was and who Eliezer Wiesel was towards these young boys who were forced into the role. It complicates things for sure. Complication is a scholarly must. It's an act of truth.
Early in the book, you describe Israel Kaplan's first draft of a Yiddish-English dictionary, which he scrawled while he was recovering in a DP camp, a DP hospital rather. And you write that Kaplan did not try to convey his pain to the public through a sequential first-person narrative at that moment, but what he was able to do was create a word list with no particular beginning, middle, or end, and no promise of personal identification or narrative closure. Now, when I read this, it felt almost like a primal attempt to vocalize something that couldn't be translated into a narrative. And I'm wondering at what point a makeshift dictionary actually becomes a kind of narrative.
That's a beautiful question, Eddie. Um, First of all, it was Yiddish Yiddish. It wasn't Yiddish English. I'm not sure how much English Kaplan knew, but in any case, let me just give you like the human scene here, which I was able to envision through, I was able to understand through his diaries, which his son Sholem Ilati, Dr. Sholem Ilati, let me read in his kitchen, which is very moving also, is that Yisrael Kaplan, he was a teacher and cultural activist from Kovna, Lithuania. He was in the Kovna ghetto and the Dachau concentration camp. He was declared dead towards the end of the war. I mean, that's how thin, how emaciated he was. He was presumed dead. He literally heard people standing over him saying, "Here's a dead body." He survived. He got himself to the Schwabing Hospital in Munich after liberation, and he's recovering. And he describes himself as still unable to digest food, and he has a swollen head with bandages around it. And he said that some boys in the hospital got tired of playing cards, so they said, "Hey, old man, will you give us a lecture?" So I love that. I don't know if that's exactly what happened or if he, kind of encouraged them to stop playing cards and listen to him. Either way, so picture this man who is bandaged and emaciated, standing in front of a crowd of ailing survivors and refugees in the Schwabing Hospital, Munich, 1945, and he says, "Listen, everyone, you need to join me in saving our inheritance." And then you think, okay, what's the inheritance? Is it going to be like, some Torah scroll or something that he found? No, his inheritance is a list of words. And the first one is ihihi, which is onomatopoeia for horse meat. He lists Musulman, which a lot of people know, the word for, an emaciated prisoner, which is what people were calling him at the time. And a bunch of other Yazdi and Koiman, traveling into the chimney, as a word for going to the crematoria. Really, quite vulgar and depressing words from a lot from the camps and some from the ghettos. This was klepsy, which was a word for theft, drawn from the Greek, like klepto. These were the words, the bizarre, onomatopoeia, lingual hybrid words that he thought were the Jewish inheritance that you had to go out and save. It's an incredible statement. So that's also a mystery. Like, why is this not just, documentary truth, but actually a valuable cultural inheritance? And I think that actually goes back to, we already answered that question in a sense by starting with Rosenfarb, that these words create post-war community. They create a Yiddish future that is authentic to Holocaust survival. And in that sense, it's an inheritance. And it's an inheritance because it shows cognitive resistance and creativity in light of language being occupied. But about your question about personhood and narrative, I think that the dictionary is incredibly personal for Kaplan. He in that he doesn't have, he's lost his dignity completely. People are laughing at him because of his physical state. They're laughing at him because he's a cultural anomaly. He's like this nerdy, bookish guy in a world of, organizators, wheelers and dealers after the war. People have been, vulgarized. Things have become crude. And here's this guy walking around with a notebook, writing everything down. People are making fun of him. They're saying, "Oh, did you get that word down, Muzelman?" And so he's an outsider. He feels like an outsider in this moment. And I don't think he's ready for storytelling. I think that the words offer a different way into experience that's not sequential. It's role playing for him. It gives him, every word brings him into a different voice. He can be someone else. He's quoting someone else. He's bringing together different communal conversations. He's also being a guide. The way that his final draft of his dictionary reads, it's like there's a guide that's walking us through the Kovna ghetto. Like, oh, note this horse meat. Oh, see this, child laborer, or so forth. And there's charm, and there's a lot of humor in what he writes too. So I think that the dictionary allowed him to enter his memories and his experiences and his pain through humorous role play, in a sense. And I don't think that it becomes a narrative, but I think it becomes a statement of self, a picture of self, in that, a self-portrait isn't a narrative, but it's a statement of self. So I think that this dictionary is a declaration, an insistence on selfhood that's not necessarily narrative.
Yes, and perhaps because Jews who were in the ghettos and the camps were essentially muted. They lost their voice, and we spoke about this a couple of nights ago at the Unser Stimme evening. And I think it was could have been Aaron Kristalka who had mentioned that there was this need for an explosion of words following 5 years of being muted, being silent. So, by virtue of just creating a word list, that in itself, to me at least, represents that kind of need for these words to emerge, even if there is no narrative.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, it's a little bit more like I see, the state of speech and language in the Holocaust a little bit maybe closer to Avram Levite, the teenager from Auschwitz whom I quoted earlier, and that the circumstances tried to mute them, but I don't think that they were muted, I mean, and again, we can't generalize about the Holocaust in general, because in ghettos there was, writing, there were writing groups, there were libraries. It wasn't easy. People, starvation was still the main experience. We can get all fancy with all kinds of topics about, like everyone. I mean, it is great that in the Vilna ghetto there was a library and people cite how many books were checked out. Still, when I read, Vilna Ghetto Diaries, the main experience is starvation. Let's not forget that. But even with a starved, body and mourning and fear, there was a lot of writing and there was a lot of talking and there was singing and the songs are incredible. The street songs, they're an incredible source for learning about language because people sang to awaken their community to what the latest words were. People stood on the street and sang words, sang songs that included new words, new Khurbn Yiddish neologisms, as a form of self-reflection, as an announcement of the latest fashion. And Oscar Rosenfeld, who was a German-speaking Jew of the Lodz ghetto, but he was very interested in Yiddish of the ghetto. He said that a word traveled around and people in the ghetto grabbed up any new word that they could as a form of stimulation. So there were different types of speech at different moments in the Holocaust, in different places, in hiding, in camps, in which camp, which ghetto, and so forth. But so there's speech, and it's not regular speech. It's speech that's in transformation, and it's speech that's in crisis. That's another argument of my book, is that there are these different poles in Holocaust discourse between people like Jean-François Lyotard, the French philosopher, who said that the Holocaust was an earthquake that broke the Richter scale, meaning you just can't talk about it. It's impossible. To others who say, look, there was writing, there was speech, there were politics, everything was fine. They were subjects, they had control of their language. I don't think either is really totally on fully correct. I think that there was a crisis of language, but people continued to speak nonetheless within the crisis, and that's where all these words came from an insistence on speaking despite the crisis. So I don't necessarily agree that there was silence and in a state of muteness and then a burst of speaking afterwards. I think though what it is that the material conditions of speaking and writing were so hard that a starved body, no pencil, or a pencil that you share with three other people, you say, it's my turn with the pencil. Rosenfarb wrote poems on her bunk in Auschwitz. The material conditions of writing and the psychic conditions of writing and speaking were so hard that once conditions got slightly easier after the war, it all poured out, with tremendous volume. I guess that's more of how I see it, rather than like going from, silence to full volume. I mean, I'm exaggerating. That's not exactly what you said, but it is important to me to address that claim of unspeakability in the Holocaust and say that I think that Khurbn Yiddish words give us a different slant on that question.
Right. I know that people like Elie Wiesel, I don't want to use the cynical term dined out, but he really camped out on the word silence for a very long time. And it became one of those shibboleths, or one of those catchwords that I don't know, maybe lost meaning after a period of time. I wanted to, this may well be my last question, I'm not sure. I don't think I have a last question, but we do have a time limit. You had talked about a Polish Jewish survivor, Shmuel Weintraub, who, amongst other things, discussed the word organizatia, which was one of the shibboleths for activism. And what struck me, and you spoke about this a little bit earlier, you mentioned Franz Kafka, who had echoed Weintraub's difficulty with the Yiddish word Antleutzung, which echoes the German word Entleutzung. Now, Kafka had stated several decades earlier in 1912, you write this in the book, that Yiddish cannot be translated into German. These are languages that produce similar sounds, but very different meanings, and this instability bold faces the difference in circumstances between life in the ghetto and life in the camps where written Yiddish was possible in one, but not really in the other. And you had just spoken about speaking and writing and the difficulty of writing in one context. Now, what I wanted to ask you was to what degree do oral and written Yiddish diverge as a matter of historical expediency?
Wow. I have to say, Eddie, these are very, very sophisticated questions. So the question, orality versus writing. Uh, One of the things that is changes about language in the Holocaust is the shift, proportional shift between writing and speaking. I mentioned other factors that change language, meaning just the sheer torment, the dense contacts among different languages, the preponderance of Nazi German terms everywhere, that signs and labels are Nazi German. Another one is, like you said, that there's a whole lot more speaking than there is writing, in that people don't have newspapers and books that they can just freely write and read anymore. And so there's a lot more that's going on orally than there is in writing. And that gives a kind of increased orality to this Khurbn Yiddish, the Holocaust Yiddish language. That's one of its features, is that it's oral, and oral languages, we know, can change more easily than written language because it's not institutionalized. When we speak orally, we don't check every single word that we say. We don't run spell checker as we're speaking. At least maybe one day we'll have like AI in our heads that's gonna, spell check everything we say. But the speech is looser. So the looseness, I think, is what is another factor that shifted language. And the looseness or the orality goes back to this question of German and Yiddish, and the interpenetration of the two languages in Holocaust spaces. Because in writing, of course, you can tell Yiddish from German, in a split second, because Yiddish is written with Jewish or Hebrew characters and German's written in Latin characters. But in speech, it's a matter of sound. Is it, and sometimes very subtle sounds, like you said, is it Entlausung, German for delousing? And in this case, Nazi German for delousing, meaning I'm taking lice off of this disgusting Jew? Or is it Yiddish, Antleusung? Sounds very similar, but meaning is completely different, because then it's Antleusung, I'm suffering from lice. Can I get these off of me, yes or no, so that I can feel like a human? So these very, very subtle oral sonic shifts have huge shifts in meaning in them, and orally you can't tell necessarily which one they are. And what people speak, and Blumenthal writes about this, is that they start to speak a hybrid. And Blumenthal has, in his archive, he has a huge essay. I barely could scratch the surface of all of his essays, but he has an essay on this. This is what he says, that people are speaking some kind of archaic, weird German Yiddish combo. And you see that in the writing, like in Shmuel Weintraub's dictionary in Unsere Stimme that you just cited, that he ends up writing. He writes Entleusung, which is a combination of the German Yiddish, and sometimes it's Antleusung and so forth. Like the orality leaves its mark on writing after the war, and the occupation, the way that
Hmm.
Nazi German occupied Yiddish, leaves its mark through that oral experience on the writing. And it's actually a cognitive penetration, not just a cultural one, meaning Nazi ways of looking at the Jewish body enter Jewish ways of looking at oneself through words like Entleusung, Antleusung, and so forth.
I think you may have just explained the whole reason for Jacques Derrida and deconstruction in that very brief
And I've maybe Shmuel Weintraub did that. These were very sophisticated
Yeah.
people, by the way. I mean, we're laughing, but it really, I mean, if you read Blumenthal's interwar writings or Elias Spivak's writings, they really are at the intellectual level of any of the big names of Kafka, Derrida, so forth. They just weren't recognized. And so that's one of the exciting things about this writing this book too for me was I just love writing about people who are 1,000 times smarter than me, Rosenfarb included. They're way ahead of us in terms of their philosophies of language, their philosophies of violence and society. And we have so much to learn from them. And Yiddish texts, Yiddish writers deserve to be treated as thinkers of the Holocaust and not just as empirical, naive empirical sources.